Hello, Frizzle Fools! It's time to review the last 9 books I read. I split them up into groups of 9 so that we can play a game with 3 rounds, and in each round I have to decide which of the books I would rather reread, rewrite, or recycle. So getting started into round 1, we have 3 books in the Penric and Desdemona series, 3 books in the Vlad Tolstoy series, and Voice of War. So yeah, it's not always exactly 9 books. I like to clump series together. The easiest decision first gets to go to rereading the Penric and Desdemona novellas. So the Penric and Desdemona series is like wholesome enough to be called cozy fantasy, but with more plot and stakes than the typical cozy fantasy book. There's a bunch of novellas in this series and they all follow our wonderful boy Penric and his demoness, Desdemona. The story kicks off when Penric accidentally contracts this demoness, and that makes him a sorcerer, and he gets recruited by the local church, which then sends him off on various missions throughout the land as a temple contracted sorcerer. And throughout the series, Penric really wrestles back and forth with different occupations and different ways that he can fulfill these roles, because he has a deep desire to learn new skills and to help people, but sometimes because he's such a sensitive man, he struggles with all of the baggage that sometimes comes with those kind of roles. So he has this magic demon that lives in his head who is very feminine, sometimes takes like a motherly role, sometimes the relationship's a little flirty, like it's so entertaining, and that relationship is definitely the core entertainment and fun of this series. The best of these 3 books that I recently read, which concludes all of the books in this series, I've now read them all, was Physicians of 𝐂𝐿𝐿each. Because I've read a handful of books that were written during the pandemic about a pandemic, and they've always been like frustrating and depressing was the main feelings I got from those depictions. You know, it just felt too raw and real and hopeless. But this novella, written during 2020 about Penric encountering like a new plague in his role as a physician, felt hopeful. Yes, there were some bleak moments. There were some moments that felt so raw of him talking about how he wanted to see his family, but he had to quarantine and all of these little details which felt very inspired by true events. But despite that reality that was brought into this little fantasy book, there was still so much hope and playfulness and fun to it that I still really enjoyed it. And I would love to reread all of this series one of these days because it would feel like returning to old friends. I gave these books 4 stars. So next we have 3 books in the Vlad Tolstoy series versus Voice of War. And the recycle has to go to Voice of War. So I totally get why this book is recommended for fans of Mistborn, because if I was feeling charitable, I would say its magic system is loosely inspired by Mistborn. However, I'm not feeling particularly charitable towards this book today, so I'm just gonna say the magic system felt like a more poorly designed ripoff of being a coin shot in Mistborn. I mean, if you're gonna make a big deal about how your magic system manipulates gravity, could you at least make it make sense in terms of gravity sites? Thank you, thank you. I started suspecting that I wasn't gonna have the best time with this book on like one of the very first pages when it used the phrase women and children to refer to like fragile non-combatants. Ooh, you just threw that phrase right in there, and then a few pages later it like tries to show us that like, no, there's lots of awesome women in this military, so many women, we have so many women warriors. Do you get to see any of them being an awesome woman warrior? No, they're too busy actually complaining about their emotions and taking care of babies in this book, but like, don't worry, it's really feminist. So like, got on my nerves right from the outset there. But like, that was all small, subtle enough bits of failed feminism, let's call it, that I could have forgiven it if the book had been good, but the thing that made this book most boring is that the characters didn't really have goals that they were working towards. Sure, this main character wanted like freedom from her oppressive elders, and that main character wanted his family to be safe, but they never really made actions to make that happen. They always just reacted to the villains, who had like nebulous goals of like gaining power or something. And this book very much felt pretty unfocused. Like at the beginning, we only had like 2 narrators. I'm like, this is fine. I wish they would tighten this up a little bit. And then midway through the book, they just like threw 3 more narrators at us. And I'm like, you are going the wrong direction. And then the book took another turn into like, now we're going to have a few scenes about monster race betting. And I'm like, no, this was the wrong direction, actually. You needed to tighten the plots and have more motivations and drive and please have the characters do something. So, it wasn't for me. I don't think it was so bad that I wouldn't pick up another thing by this author again. So we'll see, maybe one day. I gave Voice of War 2 stars. Which leaves me to rewrite the 3 books from the Vlad Tolstoy series, which are books 1, 2, and 4. You might be wondering where book 3 is. Book 3 is in this bowl, separated from everyone else because it had to be put into time out. I am so ready to rant about book 3, but it didn't deserve the spot with everyone else, so. These books are in a fantasy world with very laid-back vibes. You're not going to find any highfalutin kind of language here. We follow a guy named Vlad, and he is both an assassin and a mob boss. And over the course of the series, he's making friends with various like high noble elf people and then also ends up doing quests with them. So really there's often quite a variety of the types of plots that we get thrown in here. And I really enjoyed these books. They're like little snack-sized novels, very fast-paced, and the narrator he's very snarky and sarcastic, willing to stab people for money, but is also loyal to his friends. Provides quite a good engine to the series. The books have a vibe that is very urban fantasy without them actually taking place in our world. And one of the things that very much appeals to me about these books is it's very dump you in, and we will only explain the very minimum that you need to understand the plot. You do get enough context that the plot makes sense, but it does not stop to explain all the other political factions and stuff to you. You'll figure that out as you go throughout the series once it becomes relevant, which is just the level of sink or swim world building that I adore. Now, if there was one thing I'd want to rewrite about these books, it's how they sometimes play with the timelines. Not every book in the series, but quite a few tend to have multiple timelines running. There'll be like a past and a present, there'll be one running through the epigraphs at the beginning of the chapters, etc. And for how bite-sized most of these novels are, like 200 pages range, it often gets a little too unfocused. And it's hard to really care about the plot lines when there are so many of them and we're switching between them so often. Especially when they're not even all that connected to each other. So I gave these 3 books 4 stars, and I am excited to continue the series despite book 3. So now moving on to round 2. We have the Hexologists, Uprooted, and Kindred. So easiest decision first here. We are rereading the Hexologists. The Hexologist is a new novel that has one of my favorite tropes in it, the detective duo. And our detective duo here are a husband and wife. They solve various pesky magical crimes. So the wife is a very accomplished hexologist. She's very blunt. She's a fantastic detective and so on point all the time. And her husband carries her handbag and makes friends with people. And they make such a good detective duo, and I love their dynamic. It seems like you get 2 different types of married couples in fiction. You have the married couples that are always fighting with each other and it is a source of drama in the narrative. And then you have the married couples that are just really cute together and have an awesome relationship, and that's this kind of story. At the beginning of the novel, this duo gets a case from the king's secretary to investigate some claims to the throne by some upstart blackmailer guy. So they start investigating and things spiral from there through all of the terrible politics at play. I loved so much about this book. I loved the setting of like 1920s-ish fantasy world where everything's like Art Deco and coated in magical smog. I loved the relationship between our 2 leads. Yes, more of this, please. And I loved the writing style, which makes me definitely want to pursue more books by this author. Because I know he has like a very popular Books of Babel series, and now I do want to put that on my want to read list. Because this author uses such advanced vocabulary in the most playful way. I adore learning new words. And whenever I come across a word in a book I don't know, I look it up. And I have not had to look up so many words in a book for like 10 years. This one knocked my socks off, and I loved it. So, I would very happily reread the Hexologists. I gave it 4 stars. So then we have a conundrum, Uprooted versus Kindred. Two books that are in completely different leagues and have completely different problems that bothered me about the same amount. Okay, it's coming in pretty close, but I think I've got a better idea of how to rewrite Uprooted. Now, I went into Uprooted with a lot of expectations for it because I have heard so many reviews that are so controversially different about this. I have heard people praising the prose and the vibes and the romance, and it's all so beautiful, and this is the best book I've ever read. And when it came out, it did win its fair share of awards. So I was hoping I'd be in that camp. I've also heard people talking about how this is like the grossest, worst romance ever, and this entire book made them want to throw up and like blah, blah, blah. How could anyone ever love this book? So where do I stand on this? I'm kind of disappointed in how little romance there was in this book for how controversial it is. Like, I didn't know if I should expect a bad romance or a good romance, but I was expecting a romance. Not really. Let me talk about it. So the plot of this book is that we have a village girl, Agnieszka, and that she lives in this county where they have this wizard ruling over them, and every 10 years the wizard demands a tribute of a girl. So she gets whisked away to the wizard's tower to be locked up there for the rest of her days. And then while she's there, a lot of things happen. She starts learning some magic from the wizard, she starts flirting with the wizard, she gets involved with all of these quests that are happening because the country's at war, and most importantly, there is an evil forest ringing the country that is slowly trying to creep in on the villages and take them over. And I was really digging the first half of this book. The wizard, who is named the Dragon, and Agnieszka have a very contrary kind of relationship. They're always at each other's throats and annoying each other, and it's very entertaining. And I was kind of excited to see this turn to romance. And I was also very invested in the plotline of Agnieszka learning magic and hoping to see where this went. And then by the second half of the book, things kind of took a turn, and this is how I'd rewrite it. The first biggest failing of this book, in the second half, it made everything too easy for our protagonist. She gets so good at magic and completing quests and getting help from friends, and despite the stakes that keep getting raised with all of these more and more difficult tasks for her, it didn't feel like actually more difficult because she was just accomplishing everything with a snap of her fingers, easy peasy every time. Additionally, I think the second failing of this book is that it doesn't give enough time for its romance, because in the first half of the book, like I said, they started developing a relationship with each other, which started out very testy and then was slowly becoming more respectful on both sides, and then are separated for like the rest of the book until they come together and okay, now they're a couple. Because I can look past a lot of things, and I would have had to look past a lot of things like a several 100-year age gap and them not being the nicest to each other, especially him to her at the beginning. But the book has to make me believe that they'd make a good couple, and the book didn't put any effort into making me believe that they would make a good couple, you know? So if I was rewriting Uprooted, I would, 1, make things harder for our main character and give her less little victories throughout the book so the big ones can feel big. And 2, I would keep our 2 romantic leads together for most of the book. I don't want them separated for large chapters at a time. I gave Uprooted 3 stars. And this was the book for my book club for the month. I run a book club on Discord for my patrons. It's a few dollars a month. You can join with the link in the footnotes, and this is the book we are reading next. At the beginning of the year, I was entertaining the idea of making a video that was reading the best books of 2022, according to my favorite booktubers, and I was collecting the booktubers that had really similar taste to me and finding what books they loved in 2022. And this book, Kindred, was the one that came up most often. It was haunting and clever and thoughtful and raw and wonderfully modern for when it was written in like the 70s. So this book is about Dana, a Black woman living in the 70s, and then she suddenly finds herself just time traveling back to like the 1820s, where she has to again and again save the life of this little white boy, who then, as she starts time traveling back and forth and around his life, becomes a grown-up slave master who she discovers is one of her ancestors. And this book weaves its themes so well, with Dana really having to ask herself difficult moral questions where she doesn't just want to let this person die that she has to keep saving his life over and over, but also he's being really terribly racist slave owner, so maybe he deserves to die, but also he really can't die and she really has to do this because he's one of her ancestors, and if he dies, yeah, she's never gonna be born. And this book is just like permeated with her fear, because when she's in the past, She's in constant fear because she's in a location where she is seen as a potential slave. And then when she's in the present, she's also living in constant fear of suddenly getting time travel yanked back into the past. And I think in the end, that's what made it really difficult for me to enjoy this book, is that the entire vibe of it was just like this depressing fear, where every single victory that Dana claims always tends to just be bittersweet, where like all of her options are always bad options. And another thing that didn't really click for me about this book is that Dana is mostly reactionary, which is partly what the book is building, that in the past she doesn't have much social power in these dynamics. But it just made it even harder to hold on to and enjoy this novel and really root for Dana when all she could do was react to terrible circumstances in ways that just made everything sad and worse. So I gave Kindred 3 stars. It's a masterpiece and I see why everyone loves it, but it wasn't really for me. So before we get to round 3, we have 2 dishonorable mentions on my piece of paper here. The dishonorable mention section is for books that I gave up on so quickly that I can't give a full review for them. So like, they're the bottom of the barrel. The first one we have here is House of Suns, which I gave up on because it was incredibly boring, incredibly slow, and utterly misused the tool of first-person narration. And The Legend of Blackjack, which I gave up on because it felt incredibly sexist. We had 2 female characters in this book amongst a sea of male characters, and the 2 female characters were 1, an abusive drug addict, which the book never stopped reminding us how fat she was, and 2, a love interest girl who's constantly infantilized despite being older than our teenage protagonist boy, who just shows up to take off her shirt, give info dumps about the world, and kiss the main character. And that's about the end of her role and personality in the story. I know from skimming this book after I gave up on it that at one point she does get an awesome warrior moment and then immediately gets kidnapped so she can get saved dramatically by the main character, where she is useless for a large portion of the rest of the book. Dude, this round of reading was just not good for sexist books and them getting on my nerves. You'll see when I talk about the next ones. So now, onto round 3, our last 3 books. They are Teckla, book 3 in the Vlad Tolstoy series, Edenbrooke, and Lost in Time. Okay, so the recycle gets to go to Teckla. No contest. I hate this book with every fiber of my being. So after reading several books in the Vlad Tolstoy series that I genuinely loved, I was excited to read this next one, and it started off kind of rocky, but I kept reading it because I kept expecting it to get better because surely it would get better, right? And it just kept getting worse. So here's the plot of this one. Prior to the events of this book, our main character Vlad, you remember the assassin mob boss guy, has been married for a little while. And in this book, his wife starts getting involved in this revolution movement, where there's this oppressed working class in the city where they're at, and she wants to help them gain some political power. And the way that she's participating in this is by teaching them reading lessons. Okay, so put a pin in that. Wife is teaching reading lessons to impoverished people is the inciting incident of this book. Where do you think the plot goes? Of course, her husband, the protagonist, hates this and thinks that this is the worst thing ever, and demands that she stop doing it because she's in too much danger. And how dare she not ask his permission first? No, he doesn't want to talk about it. She just has to stop. So of course, she doesn't stop. And he just gets even more controlling and angry throughout the entire book and tries to solve it by like controlling her, threatening her friends, trying to assassinate her friends. And several times throughout this book, his wife is like, hey, how about let's like talk about this? And he's always like, there's nothing to talk about. I have no feelings. Only violence here. Listen to me, woman, and blah, 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 blah. It's so annoying. This book is like the pinnacle of showcasing toxic masculinity, where our protagonist feels threatened by his wife's independence and then spends the entire book ignoring his feelings and doing violence. And that's it. That's the plot. And you know what happens at the end of this book? His wife comes back and like apologizes and is like, hey, let's try this out again. And how dare this book do that? Because I was holding on. I was like, surely this book is about to give him a character arc where he realizes that he is being such an idiot And maybe the way to solve this problem isn't by murdering people and trying to break down everything that his wife cares about and destroy it. And I kept waiting for that moment where this book would give him his comeuppance and tear his worldview down, because it was obviously in the wrong. And then I read all the way to the end of the book and it never did. And it was just depressing and annoying, and I hated every page of this book. So I gave it 1 star. If you're gonna read this series, which I kind of recommend you do, the books so far that I've read from it have a majority of them been good, but definitely skip Teckla. Oh, and on top of everything, this book was also incredibly boring. So now we have Edenbrooke versus Lost in Time, another incredibly easy decision. We're rewriting Lost in Time. So if you read the blurb for this book, it'll pitch it kind of as like time travel dinosaur survival adventure. But here is what this book really feels like. So our main guy was on the science team that made a time machine that can send people back to the time of the dinosaurs. And of course, they've monetized this by using it as a way to kick out people who are on death row. Instead of killing them, we're just sending them back in time. You know, it's very controversial even in the book. And then our main character guy and his teenage daughter are both framed for murder. And then this book strolls around presenting the evidence and making sure we understand about how the time machine works and having conversations with the lawyers that don't actually become that important, blah, blah, blah. And this book feels incredibly slow-paced. I don't understand why people are saying it's a thriller, because we just have so many pages where barely anything's happening. But once you slog through a bunch of those, you get to the first turning point in this book, where the dad gets convicted of this murder he was framed for, sent back in time, and the daughter stays in the present, and she decides that she's going to solve this murder and find out how to get her dad back, and that becomes her new zest and drive for life. Yeah, and if I was rewriting this, I would take out so many scenes and just speed it up, because I think the bones of this book are pretty good. Like, we just have so many scenes of the dad just being sad that he has to leave everyone behind and go to the dinosaur time and there's no other option. We have so many scenes of the teen daughter investigating and finding out nothing, but she's investigating and finding out nothing and getting a clue which she doesn't pursue, and that just goes on for so many scenes. It's bloated and it had me falling asleep. So if I was rewriting this book, I would cut it down to probably about half the size, because then it could be a really snappy thriller sci-fi kind of book. But as is, I gave this one 2 stars. Then, saving the best and the most recent for last, we are rereading Edenbrooke. So after all of those very bad and meh books, I was feeling kind of really burned out and done. Like, you saw that. We had 2 dishonorable mentions and several rants in this video already. And I just kept picking up these dense fantasy and sci-fi books, and they just stopped hitting. And I decided that from here on out, starting with Edenbrooke, and I'm still ongoing with this project, I'm just gonna read romances and thriller mysteries. And that's it. I'm making a video chronicling this experience, and I'll link that in the footnotes for you. But Edenbrooke, it was just what I needed after all of these terrible books. The breath of fresh air that was this sweet Regency romance was astounding and paradigm breaking. So in this book, we followed this girl who is wrestling with the recent death and grief of her mother and trying to find her place in the world because she's always been overshadowed by her older sister. And then her and her older sister get invited to this grand manor house called Edenbrooke for the summer. And while our heroine is there, she both finds her voice and finds a man that she has a really fun and flirty relationship with that there's also plenty of emotional angst tied up in, as you want in any good romance, in my opinion. This book was so cute. I connected to the main character so well. Our male love interest in this book is incredibly flirty, bantery, and that kept the pace rolling and everything being so exciting when they were spending time with each other. And because I was so invested in our main character and her emotional health, whenever she had any kind of setback, whether it be connected to the romance or her other dealing with her family issues, I was devastated. And whenever she had a success, I was cheering, and I almost cried on this book several times, both happy and sad tears. I would very happily reread Edenbrooke and very happily recommend it. I gave Edenbrooke 4 stars. And those are my recently read books. Thank you for watching.